This video is brought to you by Ground News. For the last few months, much of the fighting in Ukraine has been centred around Bakhmut, a small town in Donbass with a pre-war population of about 70,000. After months of stasis and at enormous cost, however, in the last couple of months, the Russian army have made a couple of strategically significant breakthroughs to the north and south, and the thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut are now under more pressure than ever before. So in this video, we're going to look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks, whether the Ukrainians can hold on to Bakhmut, and what all this means for the wider trajectory of the war. Now, before we get on to the most recent developments around Bakhmut, a quick look at what's happened elsewhere. There are basically three other places along the front lines that have seen movement in the past couple of weeks. In the south, around Zaporizhia, southern Donetsk, in the outskirts of Donetsk city, Avdiivka and Marinka, and northern Luhansk, along what's known as the Svatove-Kreminna line. In Zaporizhia, for the last couple of weeks or so, the Russians have been trying to advance north along the coast of the Dnipro, moving up from the town of Vasilivka towards Kamyansk and from Tokmak up to Orikhiv. If the Russians were to take Orikhiv, this would be pretty bad news for the Ukrainians, both because it's an important logistics hub in the region and any advance could presage an attack on Zaporizhia city. A week or so ago, there was a lot of excited chatter on Russian Telegram channels about a new Russian offensive in Zaporizhia, where the Russians have been amassing troops for some time now. Unfortunately for the Russians, their advances here seem to have stalled. Having reached the outskirts of Kamyansk and Orikhiv last week, they've been unable to make progress, and the front lines haven't really moved at all. This might be something to do with the fact that Ukrainians successfully destroyed a bridge over the Molodcha River, which the Russians were using to supply troops in the area. Moving on to southern Donetsk, the Russian advance towards both Avdiivka and Marinka has also run into trouble. Again, a couple of weeks ago, it looked like the Russians were making progress in both places, and Russian military bloggers have been claiming for some time now that Marinka was about to fall. However, open source intelligence from the last week or so has made it clear that most of the suburb, which has been completely reduced to rubble after 8 years of intensive fighting, is still under Ukrainian control, and the Russian advance has apparently run out of steam. It's a similar story with Avdiivka. While the Russians have made some progress to the south of Avdiivka, moving west from Donetsk towards the tiny settlement of Vodiane, they're yet to take it. And even then, it's not clear what its strategic value would be or how it would help them take Avdiivka. In some sense, this is unsurprising. Ukrainians have been fighting around Donetsk since 2014, and they've set up some pretty impressive fortifications there. Finally, before we get on to Bakhmut, a quick look at northern Luhansk, where the front lines have apparently stabilised a bit. Since the Kharkiv offensive in September, the Ukrainians have been trying to reach the towns of Svatove and Kreminna. Both towns sit on the P66 highway, which the Russians use to transport supplies down from southwest Russia to Russian forces in places like Severodonetsk, Lysychansk and Bakhmut. Previously, the Ukrainians were making slow but steady progress, taking the small town of Novoselivsk earlier this month and moving towards the suburb of Sosnovyi, which sits above Svatove and would allow the Ukrainians to put more pressure on Russian positions. However, in the last few days, the Russians have pushed back, and there's not much movement anymore. Finally, looking at Bakhmut, where most of the fighting is happening. Since we did our last Ukraine map update, the Russians have continued to make incremental progress in their attempt to encircle Bakhmut. For context, there are basically three supply routes from the Ukrainians into Bakhmut. The T0513 road, which runs south from Siversk, the MO3, which runs southeast from Sloviansk, and the T0504, which runs northeast from Kramatorsk to Kostiantynivka. Having captured Soledar earlier this month, last week the Russians captured Blaodne, which means they've essentially cut off the T0513. At about the same time, it was confirmed that the Russians captured Klishchivka, another tiny settlement just south of Bakhmut, and were moving on to Ivanivsky. Fighting is ongoing in the outskirts of Ivanivsky, but if the Russians can take it, or even more of Klishkivka, straight to Chaziv Yar, they'll cut off the T-0504, which will mean the Ukrainians will have just one road, the M03, in and out of Bakhmut. This would be dangerously precarious. If the Russian advance just a couple of kilometers southwest from Blaodne to the southernmost point of Paraskov-Ivka or west towards Minkivka, then they'll be able to cut off the M03 as well, which would leave the Ukrainians in Bakhmut stranded. Now, it's important not to overstate all this. At this point in the war, when the media is laser focused on tiny villages and hamlets, Bakhmut can sound like the be-all and end-all, but ultimately it's a small town with a pre-war population of just 70,000 people. It's been bombed so heavily that it can't really act as an effective logistics hub, and it's not even the largest remaining Ukrainian holdout in Donbass. The Russians still have to somehow take Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which both had pre-war populations 50% higher than Bakhmut. It's also worth saying that, while the Russians have definitely made progress around Bakhmut, it's taken them literally months, and things will only get harder as they near the city. Of course, Bakhmut has symbolic value, especially for the Russians. They've spent many weeks, thousands of men and tons of material trying to take it, and it would be their first significant victory in a while. But its strategic value is, well, pretty limited. Nonetheless, while Bakhmut itself might not be that important, the operational encirclement of the thousands of Ukrainians inside the town would be an unequivocal disaster for the Ukrainian army. It's hard to know precisely how many troops Ukraine has in Bakhmut and the surrounding areas, but estimates put it between 8 and 10 brigades. At full capacity, each brigade has over 3,000 men and hundreds of armoured vehicles, which means that the total number of Ukrainian soldiers in and around Bakhmut could be as high as 30,000, or about 20% of Ukraine's total army. If even a significant fraction of these were encircled by the Russians, it would be a disaster, both strategically and symbolically, which is probably why, according to a report in the Kyiv Post last week, American officials have started advising Ukraine's high command to begin their withdrawal and retreat to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Again, there's a clear rationale for withdrawal. Bakhmut has limited strategic value, and the Ukrainians just need to wait it out in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk until new Western weapon systems are delivered in due course. But it would be a symbolic loss, which is probably one of the reasons the Ukrainians are understandably reluctant. What happens next will depend on whether the Russians can continue to make gains and the risk appetite of Ukraine's high command. Getting exact data and information from the ground is difficult though, making it hard to track either exact lines of fighting or Russian sentiment. Gauging what people in different countries think about the news is super difficult, but that's what Ground News, a website and app, helps you do, comparing how breaking news is covered around the world.
That's because for every story, you get bias, factuality, and ownership ratings for the news sources that are reporting on the topic.
It's a fantastic way to access global news from diverse viewpoints, so you can see how international stories are being covered by news outlets on the ground or in neighbouring countries. For example, I can quickly compare headlines from government-affiliated sources to get a sense of how governments, even democratically elected ones, can steer media coverage. They have several editions to make sure you're getting news that's relevant to your region, including 4,000 news sources in the UK alone. If you want an even more customised experience, you can follow specific people, places, or topics that interest you most, like politics, Europe, and the economy. It really is a fascinating way to read the news, and unlike any news app out there. To give it a try, go to ground.news/TLDR. You can subscribe to get unlimited access to all features and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.